That's the cultural shift that we need to change in terms of worldviews, removing humans from the center and returning to the center more of a concentric relationship understanding of our place with nature.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Kia ora, welcome. Today's conversation is with Erin Matariki Carr of River Collective. Erin is of Maori descent from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And if you're interested in the topic of rights of nature, then I think you'll really enjoy this discussion. Erin is Nai Tuhoi. She is of the place where Te Uruwera Rainforest was granted legal personhood and rights of nature status in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This was the first body of nature to gain such status. So we talk about her firsthand experience and perspective of what that's been like, as well as what she sees as the journey ahead. Erin also discusses the different mechanisms and history of colonization in Aotearoa, as well as her work around all things constitutional transformation. It's a deep and far-reaching discussion we had at Bioneers in April 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Erin Matariki Carr. Welcome, Erin Matariki Carr. Erin is the project lead in Kaiākau of River. We're here just wrapping up Bioneers. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah.
What does Kaiākau mean?
Kaiākau is like the riverbank, and ako is the riverbank actually, or it means like a beach or a curve. And kai is sort of the prefix that we put onto a word to help make it the person of that word, if that makes sense. So like mahi means work, kai mahi means worker. And so I really like that about our language actually, because kai also means to eat. And so kai work or kai mahi as worker is almost like saying, just like you are what you eat, you are what you do. And so, the things, I think it encourages us to really own the mahi or the work, or to see that as part of ourselves rather than just a separate action. So Kaiākau is our word for project lead with River. It recognizes we're the banks of the river that might guide our projects, but we're not the river itself. Those are the collective that joins in with us. So,
nice. Yeah. I'd love to go into River, but first maybe if you can share a bit more about who you are, where you come from, and your language, your culture.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, so I te taho tōku kraua, ko maunga pohatu te maunga, ko te tauranga te awa, ko taua nui te pā, ko te whakatāne te hapu, ko nai tūhoi te iwi. I te taho tōku kuia, ko pūtawa ki te maunga, ko rangitai ki te awa, ko koko hino te marae, ko te pahipoto te hapu, ko Ngāti awa te iwi. So, ko Erin Matariki Carr tōku ingoa. I've just shared that on my grandfather's side, my mother's father, maunga pohatu is my mountain, our river is te tauranga, tauanui is our pā, and te whakatāne is my hapu, which is like a sub-tribe, and Nai Tūhoi is my iwi, which is our tribal nation, and we come from Te Uruwera, big rainforest. And on my mother's side, I'm from Ngāti awa, so Pūtawaki is our mountain, Rangitaki is our awa, our river, and Kokohino is my marae, and my hapu or sub-tribe is Te Pahipoto of Ngāti awa tribal. And so those two iwi, those two tribal nations are neighbours. My grandmother's people they were swamplands. They were drained to become dairy farms now and kiwi fruit now. And my grandfather's place is this huge rainforest, which is largely intact, thankfully. Te Uruwera, also known as Te Manawa o Te Ika a Maui, like the heart of the great fish of Maui, which is the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the other name for Tūhoe there is known as the Children of the Mist, because the rainforest is often shrouded in mist. So Hine Pukohurangi is the Mist Maiden, and we say we've been there since the mist married the mountain. Whereas my Ngātiawa side, we say we came with the waka from Polynesia, on Mātātua. And so that's my background. Those are the landscapes that I come from. And I'm also Welsh and Croatian on my mum's side, and English predominantly, and Irish on my father's side. Yeah.
And throughout this conversation, I imagine we're going to reference a number of Māori words, and we'll do our best to provide some context to listeners. But I think it's part of the gift that you transmit, and you transmitted here at Bioneers. You gave a keynote.
Yeah.
It was extremely well received, a resounding standing ovation. It was so heartwarming to see you up there on stage representing Aotearoa, and to see how the magic that everyone felt from your talk. How was it for you?
Thank you. No, it was mind-blowing, for sure. It's different for me to be on a stage, especially with lights, and I'm used to sharing kōrero or discussion with people, but more like this, or maybe in a classroom or something like that. So that was definitely a new space for me, but it was quite sweet. I couldn't really see. So when I was coming off stage, I think Nina and Kenny, who've just been so lovely to welcome me to the Bioneers space, pushed me back on stage, and it started turning around, and I could start seeing these shadows of people standing up, and it's really lovely. It's a totally new thing. Especially the clapping, we don't do that so much in Aotearoa. So I notice a lot of clapping when people want to support you. They really do over here. So
the Americans love to clap.
It's a whole deal. It should be a sport.
And can you share some of the messages and threads that you shared during your keynote speech? We'll also link to that here in the show notes.
Yeah, well, a lot of the message I wanted to get out was kind of what was happening in Aotearoa, and a bit more about Aotearoa. I feel like sometimes the things people know is like we have sheep, Lord of the Rings, Jacinda Ardern made it to quite well known, but maybe less about the Māori people or, our history that we share in this global connected world of ours. So a big kind of point of the message was really wanting to share about law and the resurgence of kawa and tikanga, which is the Māori legal system that's happening over there, and to acknowledge some of the work that we've been doing there with the Constitutional Transformation Project to really uplift basically Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, and Ranginui, who's the Sky Father, and to recenter them in our legal system at the heart of our Constitution. And just to connect, really. And, of course, to use as an example of this movement the legal personhood of Te Uruwera, which is the rainforest that my grandfather's people of Ngāi Tūhoe, which was a huge legal innovation in 2014. I think was the first rainforest to be granted legal personhood, which means that she owns herself now. And that was totally unimaginable 20 years ago. So I felt like that was a really hopeful and powerful message to share, that actually when you get challenged on what's realistic, especially for Indigenous people trying to win against, colonial settler governments, often you get caught in this battle of imagination where settler colonial governments feel like, no, that's not realistic. You can't have that. You can only have this, not this. And so the idea of legal personhood and what the space that's carved out for Ngāi Tūhoe as a people to reclaim a sense of authority and decision-making within our homelands is just so exciting. And we're just at the start of it now. There's some things I can share today a little bit more in detail about what's happening in the ground, but I just wanted to share some hope with the crew here and meet some amazing people, and I have. Bioneers has been great.
Yeah, and I'd love to go deeper into Te Uruwera because, I believe it was the first body of nature that was granted legal personhood, or what's commonly referred to globally as rights of nature, although not necessarily the preferred term in Aotearoa.
Nice.
And built upon, a movement that started with Ecuador and Bolivia. But still, Aotearoa has been one of the first countries to embrace this movement, and also uniquely has these three bodies of nature now that have been granted legal personhood rights. The other two being Mount Taranaki, the Taranaki Maunga, and as well as the Wanganui River. And so, tell us more about this beautiful Te Uruwera Rainforest, how that process has come about, your involvement in this process, and what you're observing on the ground in your homeland.
Oh, wicked. It's a bit of a story, so you
please
just interject.
That's what
when
we're
you
here
want.
for. That's what we're here for.
Okay, cool. Well, I think it's really important to just acknowledge, how Aotearoa is sort of in the world, since time immemorial, right up until, say, 1814, Māori have been absolutely governing Aotearoa, and sovereignty, mana motu hake, which is like our word for self-determination or chieftainship, and tino rangatiratanga is another phrase that we use for that, since time immemorial until just, less than 200 years ago. And then, 1814 missionaries arrived, and that started to have a really impact on our communities. And then 1835, so we had this honeymoon period really, but just to show how recent this is, 1835, especially the northern chiefs in Aotearoa, issued he whakaputana o te rangatiratanga o New Tireni, which is the Declaration of Independence of New Tireni, which is the translate for New Zealand. And the point was there, and it was recognized by the British Crown, that these are sovereign tribal nations. And then, so that was our way. We already knew that, of course, but we wrote it down in a way that could be recognized by European powers who are starting to visit our shores and trade with us. And then 5 years later, in 1840, we realized, people are coming to stay, and not only that, but the ones that are coming out early, they're quite ruckus, where they landed was up north, and they were quite dominant and messy, and they're definitely into marriages and relationships, but there's a big group there, and we realized, we want some people, their people, to come in and manage and govern them. So we go, okay, well, what's a good way? We have a treaty. So we sat down in February 1840, had debates, most held in Te Reo Māori, in the Māori language, and we agreed on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the one treaty between Māori and the British Crown, which I think is really unique. And as I'm learning here in Turtle Island, lots of treaties, which means lots of different battlegrounds for debate and about power. But for us, it's just this one single treaty, and which means that the story of the constitutional shifting transformation makes it simpler, I guess, more simple. So in that treaty, in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, you have Māori retain tino rangatiratanga, our ultimate chieftainship, and we grant the British Crown a right to govern in our whenua, in our lands, their people. It made no sense, and nowhere in the history of anyone's constitution would a people voluntarily give up their sovereign power to another. And so that's the heart of Te Tiriti. There's other things we could talk about, but that's the heart of it.
And the population size, excuse me for interrupting, but I think it's important for context, like the population size of Māori versus settlers was, Māori dwarfed the number of settlers, is that correct?
Totally. We were about 100,000 Māori at the time, and about 2,000 Pākehā settlers at the time. And Pākehā is our word for settlers, more specific to British settlers, I guess. Yes, totally. So even in that context, And the reason why this is important is because there was a translation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi into English. And in that translation, which was not debated, British Crown claimed that we ceded sovereignty to the Crown and that we still retained some ownership over our fisheries and our lands and our taonga, or our special treasures. And so there's these two treaties, but actually international law, and the one that was signed by the majority of Māori, like over 500 signatures, is on Te Tiriti. And there's maybe 50 or less on the treaty. So the one that stands at international law is Te Tiriti, and that's the only one I talk to. Anyway, so there's our context for this sort of power dynamic, and also really important to understand that it's Te Tiriti that grants any legitimacy for the British Crown to have any governance power in Aotearoa or to establish a government like we have today. So this is kind of the edge of the debate right now with the constitutional transformation movement is, and there are essays written, one by Claire Charters, it's called The Elephant in the Courtroom, where she challenges the judiciary to start calling out the legitimacy of Parliament, New Zealand Parliament, to be making rules over Māori people, because the heart of Te Tiriti says otherwise. So it's a really exciting times.
Before we go further, I mean, because this is obviously, these are big statements, right? I mean, we're talking about constitutional transformation for a country, or the interpretation of constitutions for a country. So I'd love to just make sure we're really rooted in that context. So 1840, there's a treaty signed, roughly 100,000 Māori, 2,000 settlers. It was written into Reo Māori, the Māori language, and it allowed for the settlers to have some sovereignty of governing themselves. But it certainly, from a Māori perspective, didn't cede sovereignty to the British Crown. But then, of course, fast forward, 150 years, and where are we at? I mean, I think the latest statistic I heard is that Māori have less than 2 or 3% of the land now. 4% of the land in Aotearoa. So, and obviously, the stories of colonization aren't exclusive to Aotearoa, but certainly very similar in a lot of contexts and ways, in terms of there were wars, there was, grave injustices, there were just massive hollowing out of culture, language. There's been just so much violence that's happened. And, I'm an immigrant to Aotearoa, so, my understanding and education is still fairly limited. But it's certainly a culture and a country that seems to be reckoning with its colonization and its history much more than other places I've been. So from that perspective, I guess hopeful insofar as there's an alive conversation and that there's a lot of acknowledgement that there's still a lot of work to do around the healing and around the reconciliation and how we move forward and how that's a living conversation. Are there other things that you'd like to just help people understand the context of colonization to where we are now?
Yeah, I really appreciate that frame too, because it's true. Like, I can share all the wonderful wins that we have, but the reality is today, Māori women in particular, the most imprisoned people per capita, like of specific culture in the world. Wow. And over 61% of our female prisons are women, Māori women. And our men aren't doing too much better. Over 51% of the prison population are Māori men.
And what percentage of all of Aotearoa New Zealand's population is Māori?
17%. So, that's insane, ridiculous. And that's the urgent side of the battle right now in terms of decolonizing the state. And I do talk about, that's one side of the movement, is decolonizing, which I'd say is really about fighting against colonial systems, very, very urgent work and very tiring work. And the other side of that, which we'll talk about too, is this restoration of the Māori culture, and what you mentioned, healing. A lot of that is, and we need time to do that. So you can't really expect Māori to be doing this side of the work and this side of the work of decolonizing and then trying to heal ourselves. Really, we need to be spending a lot more time healing and restoring our culture, our language, our laws, and our ways of being together and sharing space, so that we can be more abundant and be able to, share that wider than just our own people. But in terms of like stepping back and looking at colonization, I talk about 3 mechanisms, which is really important, I think, for people to kind of hold in their mind when they think about colonization and decolonization, or even what the work is ahead of us. And I think the first mechanism, I call them mechanisms because they're not over, like they're not like an era. It's a strategic mechanism. So one is the doctrine of discovery, which in short is when the European powers 500 years ago gave themselves, through the Pope, the theological, political, legal, moral authority to go out and conquer new lands and take people, steal bodies, take them somewhere else, to claim these lands in the names of their monarchies, in the name of God, and to convert or kill Indigenous peoples or pagans who they thought were against the Christian church. So that's a really important part of our history that is only really coming to the fore now. The doctrine of discovery has recently been repudiated, which is really interesting because it sits as the moral justification for colonization and for the Crown owning any land in Indigenous lands. So now that that's been repudiated, there's a lot of questions flowing around. Okay, what does that mean for the house of cards that's stacked upon this foundation? The second mechanism of colonization is the disconnection of Indigenous peoples from their land and their language and their culture, and it's the displacement of people and dispossession of people. And I think, when you think about that, that's the actual impact violence, the wars that we mentioned, which happened in Aotearoa around the 1860s. So only 15 years after the signing of the treaty, more and more settlers arriving, and then it was on. There were land wars, which we also call the sovereignty wars. And spread of disease and all of these tactics. So that's the actual violence, that second mechanism, the actual disconnection of people. And then the third mechanism is, we call it just strategic amnesia, which is just forgetting all of that happened. So that in your education systems, you don't teach any of the history of the place. What you do teach is Mother England. You make sure that the young people growing up, actually there's tension around being Māori. And I felt that, as a teenager, even though I was living in a very Māori town, there was being Māori meant you were poor, or you were likely to be criminal, you were likely dumber than anybody else. And those are the concepts that we internalize colonization that happens because of amnesia, the strategic unknowing or dismembering of our history. So those 3 mechanisms together, I feel like knowing them and being able to visualize, and they're oversimplified, there's obviously a lot more packed in, but knowing them allows us to then identify what's the work to push against that. Yeah. And so it guides a lot of kind of our strategy for decolonization, but also gives us that kaha, or the strength for restoration and loving ourselves and learning how to believe in ourselves again, which is really the work of that restorative side.
Got it. So just to recap, there's the doctrine of discovery, which was kind of the moral basis for a lot of what colonization became. There's the actual violence that happened, and then there's the strategic amnesia, as you called it. And as a white person that has grown up in an American privileged context, whether this conversation is about the relationship with slavery and African Americans, whether it's the conversation about Native Americans and genocide, whether it's the conversation with Māori and Aotearoa, I find a common psychological response for people who look like me, and that I've certainly felt, is like, yeah, but this is the past, and like, why are you blaming me for what my ancestors may or may not have done? People who are of the same ethnic heritage as me, like, I can't control that, and like, it's uncomfortable to think that I have to take responsibility. Like we all are born into existence in kind of a fresh start, so to speak. And yeah, I'm curious, like, how does that land for you, and how would you respond?
Yeah, I would say that's a symptom of the amnesia. And because, the past shapes the now and influences the future. I wish it stopped in the past, like that's great if that worked like that. It doesn't. And the structures that have been established of the basis of this intense violence are the structures that uphold the power dynamics today. So like we say, we're prisoners in our own land. Most Māori do not own homes in their own land. We're renting or we're homeless. Like these realities are a direct result of the intergenerational violence and trauma that's been caused. So I would encourage people to learn the history so that you can find yourself and your position in it today to actually influence a far more just future, because it's not just justice for Indigenous people. If we can remove the structures that we have, the violence that's been upheld by this violence, it's going to benefit everybody. And I feel like one really important part of the history lesson that, I hope everyone goes on their own journey is the colonization of Europe itself. We're all from the earth. We're all of our bodies connect to an ancestral place somewhere. And Europe was colonized before the European monarchy started stretching out across the world. Even the same tech, like within the Doctrine of Discovery, one of the papal bulls. So the Doctrine of Discovery is a series of these papal bulls, which are basically documents issued by the Pope granting permission to do stuff. One of them was known as the Witches' Bull, which was given out in the 15th century, and it was permission to find women who were, Indigenous women to their lands, who were plant medicine, who had intimate relationships with the lands there, finding them, declaring them to be witches, and hanging them or burning them at the stake. And that genocide is estimated between 600,000 and 9 million women, some men and some children, were murdered during that time, and is also acknowledged as the birth of patriarchy. So that's the colonization, the brutal one aspect of colonization in Europe that led to this violent perspective, very patriarchal perspective that we now entitled by the right of God to go out and claim everybody else's lands. So if we can understand even deeper history, we can see we've all been colonized. We live in a colonized reality which upholds this great imbalance and which is affecting the actual seasons of the planet. The actual seasons have been impacted because this has led to climate change. And the IPCC just acknowledged that for the first time. Was it last year? The report came out, it might have been 2021, acknowledging the connection between colonization and climate change. That it's spread, colonization spread this, globalized this view that humans are detached from nature and we are owners of her as a property rather than belonging to her. And then through the industrial era, which is a very extractive, damaging, destructive era, all led by those philosophies. So yeah, that would be my encouragement is learn that stuff. Join the movement. We're all in it together.
Yeah, I think that's the key message, right? Is that we're all in it together. And when we recognize that we're all bound in this together and that we recognize that we are a lineage of ancestors. And, I think that our modern capitalist system teaches things like compound interest effectively. And we have this kind of understanding and appreciation for how things compound when it comes through a financial lens. Right. I think we need to bring that lens also to our ancestral violence and colonization and so forth, and understand what has been compounding, and then now what is the context that we all find ourselves in, and if we want to be of service in this life that we're given, it's good to be informed about context, and that requires an understanding of history. And I certainly have a lot to learn and grow into in that realm. But really appreciate your voice in this. And I want to bring it back to Te Uruwera.
Yeah,
So that's how we had started this conversation is, okay, so we've set a bit of the context about Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now maybe you can speak a bit more about the rainforest.
Yeah, the rainforest. So such a shining example, I think, of actually what can be achieved. So it is a result of a treaty settlement, which is the connection back to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, a lot of effort by our ancestors, my grandfather's generation and younger, actually my uncles, aunties, really pushing for acknowledgement by the Crown. So there's this treaty settlement, like a truth and reconciliation kind of thing. So in 2014, Ngāi Tūhoe settled with the Crown. And just a side note, like treaties are made to be honoured, not settled. So there's inherent problems here, but it's okay. And as part of the settlement with Tūhoe and the Crown, there were two pieces of legislation that came out. And one's the Tūhoe Claims Settlement Act, which really allowed for transfer of some money back to Tūhoe and for us to establish an office. That's great. And the other was Te Uruwera Act, 2014. And that act acknowledges that Te Uruwera is ancient, enduring, a fortress of nature, alive with history, and that she is no longer a national park, which happened in the 50s, and that she now owns herself. She's a legal person. All of the establishment land of her body is now vested in herself, and which is a really big first-time thing that happened, 2014. There's been a board appointed to act as her voice, to communicate on her behalf to other humans. And in 2017, that board, which is made up now of 6 Tūhoe and 3 Crown representatives, which is very unique, in 2017, they issued Te Kawa o Te Uruwera. Mm-hmm. So you have now a territory of land that owns herself. She's no longer a national park. She's a homeland, again, once more, Ngāi Tūhoe. A board that represents and governs her on her behalf, and under a management plan which has teeth under the Act called Te Kawa o Te Uruwera. Now, Te Kawa or Kawa is one element of our legal system in Te Ao Māori or in Tūhoe. The other element is tikanga. So you'll hear these words a lot, kawa and tikanga. The way I like to explain how these two elements work together is to use the jaw as a metaphor. So the upper jaw is like kawa, it never moves. It's nature's truth, it's nature's laws. So the fact that the Earth Mother was here first before us and that she's our mother, that we come from her, something that will never change. That's a natural law. Mm-hmm. And so that's the upper jaw, kauwairuna. And then tikanga is the lower jaw, which moves and adapts as is needed by the situation, like how we're speaking to each other now. And that's tikanga is more about the right way of doing things. So that's more about human regulation, human law. So Te Kawa o Te Uruwera, this management plan, which now governs this territory, as like our legal system that we're offering to be our constitution, really. And when you read it, it doesn't read like a management plan, like we must kill 80% of possums or whatever. It reads more like prose, more like inspiration, mm-hmm. trying to inspire people to commit to her care. Mm-hmm. And so the heart of it, the kind of starting point in Te Kawa o Te Uruwera is that we reject resource management in favour of human management for the benefit of the earth, mm-hmm. for the benefit of the land. Mm-hmm. So what's the difference between those two things? In resource management, you're assuming that Papatuanuku, this ancient, enduring life force that has given us life and totally sustains us, is just a resource, and as commodity, therefore, and as passive or even dead in some ways of hearing that word, resource. Mm. And so that's wrong, that's arrogant to assume that she is just merely this resource. And then the other side of actually assuming that we could manage her, like her living systems are totally beyond our perception. The way that a butterfly connects to the fish in the stream, connects to the birds or the forest or different types of berries, whatever, it's beyond our perception. So how could we ever assume that we're so superior that we could manage that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a total rejection of that. And it's interesting because in Aotearoa, like our major piece of legislation governing land is called the Resource Management Act. So there inherent is the massive worldview difference.
Yeah, and it's a real pain in the butt.
It's a real pain in the butt. You can't do things. It's getting totally pulled apart right now, but that's another conversation. And so human management for the benefit of the earth recognizes that nature knows what she's doing. She's been doing it for a long time. Humans are the ones creating the impact, right from, like we say, cutting a track for our own convenience of access, right through to building our homes or spilling toxic waste or, climate change. Like, we need management. So human management is about turning the focus back onto us and taking responsibility of care and being in reciprocity with Earth, knowing and grounding ourselves in the reality that she provides us with everything and that we are the ones that have to now reciprocate. So how do we do that? And that's, I guess, the edge of the thinking right now back home is how do we decondition from this intergenerational colonial project that, of course, has impacted us? How do we recognize those colonial pieces of our behavior and take those out? And how do we reconnect to tūhoitanga, or what it means to be tūhoi? How do we restore ourselves and heal, and then come back to the land and to rebuild our intimacy with her so that we can be in genuine reciprocity with Te Uruwera, and as an extension of Te Uruwera, Papa Tuanuku, Earth Mother. And so you'll see that's where we're at right now. That's where a lot of the debates are. It's like understanding our impact and acting accordingly. Yeah.
And why is it so important to reclassify from a national park into this notion that she owns herself? Because some might hear national park and think, great, it's already conserved, it's already protected.
Yeah.
So what's like the material difference between those two paradigms or those two approaches? And I guess tying that also to where you are now of that reconnection.
That's a great question. So I get that national parks sound like a great idea because, you've conserved this piece, but inherent in a national park is the disconnection of the human from the land. Because you're saying, okay, well, here's the wilderness. We're just going to keep that there. And now humans, you can operate over here. And a very painful separation for people who are from that land because you're disconnecting, again, that mechanism of pulling people away from their land, removing the intimacy of understanding and reciprocity, removing our ability to exercise authority over that space, to eat from that space, to build our homes there, to raise our children there, to be influenced by the sounds and the living systems in our own language. It's Te Reo Māori. The Māori language is a natural language. You take most any word and it's been informed by a process in nature or by the birds. And so by just claiming, centering that off and then saying conservation, which, by the way, is a really unambitious word, I'm just going to conserve this as it is. I hope that anyone working in conservation turns their attention more to healing and restoration and vibrant. I want conserving something as a state is just so, it's a low bar. So, National Park was, even despite all of the violence that Tūhoe went through, the National Park is probably one of the worst things that could have happened because over the generations we were disconnected and we forgot. We forgot about how to exercise authority and be in tune with Te Uruwera. And that's what our work is now.
Well, I think it's a really important message. I just want to emphasize to people working in conservation because I think it can be, with all well intentions, from an ecological lens, saying, great, we absolutely need to conserve the existing biodiversity, carbon sequestration, old growth forests, et cetera, that are on this planet, functioning watersheds, and act, at all costs to make sure that, development and destruction doesn't ensue. But to hear that juxtaposed with the, creating Te Uruwera a framework that calls it a national park was one of the most violent acts of colonization that could have happened to your people, I think is, it's a good wake-up moment, I think, to make sure that we're thinking about conservation really deeply and thoughtfully.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's the thing is like, nature, she made people. Like, we're supposed to be here. And I know it's an attractive argument, so we're a pest on the planet and should be better without us. But I don't think, that's not where my mind goes. I think she wants us, but we need to be in reciprocity. We need to be in friendship with Papatūānuku. And that's one of the key elements that we're inviting with people now. So if you want to work with Te Uruwera, and even in conservation, whatever it is, we're actually saying you need a friendship agreement with Te Uruwera. That's our leadership right now within Te Uru Taumatua, the Tūhui office. And I really like that because it sort of sounds really weird, you know, different people, whether they're tour guides or helicopter pilots wanting to take in hunters or whatever. They go, what do you mean a friendship agreement? You say, oh, well, you have friends, don't you? Like, what does it mean to be a friend? It means to be, you know, I care about your well-being. I'm interested in how you are. If I take something, I want to return something, you know, like, and over time we have a balance that keeps us friends. And so instead of the national parks have concession agreements, so say I want to go to a national park, I might go to DOC, the Department of Conservation, say, oh, I want to take my tour group, it's a commercial activity, I'll transact with you, I'll pay you a fee, and you give me a license, and now I'm allowed to go in there. She's completely out of the conversation. Right. It's just you and I getting to agree and transact. Whereas friendship agreement takes away that transaction and makes you focus on, oh, what am I giving to this place though? So it might be simple. It might be like, oh, well, I'm taking a group of 10 people. We're going to pick up every piece of rubbish that we see. Or maybe I'm going to shift my business model to actually be less about touring and wandering through and more about setting traps. And people that come here are now going to be stewards and caregivers, and they're going to learn something, but they're going to be in reciprocity. And that's the cultural shift that we need to change in terms of worldviews, removing humans from the center and returning to the center more of a concentric relationship understanding of our place with nature. So that's a really exciting piece of work that's happening right now.
I love it. And it all kind of gets wrapped up in this conversation around rights of nature, which has been very prevalent here at Bioneers this year and in years past. And I mentioned before, alluded to, that rights of nature isn't necessarily the term that is the most commonly well received in Aotearoa. I'm wondering how you kind of describe this field and how you relate to that term.
Yeah, rights of nature. I mean, it's lovely. I don't want to take away from the actual movement because it is very powerful. I guess I just want to remind the movement that humans can't grant nature rights. You know, that's also kind of this I'm on top sort of worldview. It's a humbling, you know, and just saying we're recognizing that nature's always had rights, if we're going to use that term of rights. And the focus should be less on rights and more on responsibilities. So if you're saying human management for the benefit of the earth, then it's human responsibilities to be in reciprocity with the earth. And that's a really challenging and important shift in perspective, because that is grounding us back into the Indigenous perspective, which is natural for all of us, I think. Anyone that I talk to, no matter where they come from, they start to feel that in their body, no matter where they're from. This idea that we actually have to take responsibility, that we're, in Tūhoi's view, the youngest child of Papatūānuku, of the Earth Mother, where the trees and the birds are all our older siblings. And no matter where I travel, there's a similar thing with other Indigenous cultures, and it's true for all of us, no matter where you come from. So I would say, responsibilities first, let that be the focus of your work, because that means we're shifting ourselves. We're not lifting Papatūānuku up over us, which is sort of like, or even lifting her to have rights like humans have rights. You know, that's sort of, it's fine because the language helps spread the message, but if you're going to the heart of it, let it be about responsibilities of care.
Yeah. And I love how these paradigms invite us into, I mean, so much of the environmental movement, as I experience it in the United States, and here we are in 2023, you know, it tends to be things that feel very binary, you know, conservation, for example, like, okay, keep all the humans out of that land, or discussion and debate around animal agriculture, like, don't eat meat, you know, and I feel like that, you know, taking the paradigm of like, I have a responsibility and I belong here and that I am the child of a Mother Earth, like it just reframes the root of so much of how then I can make these different navigational decisions along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we're finding. So some of the initiatives that are being led out by Te Uru Taumatua and Tūhoe whānau families is that. So, okay, responsibilities to nature doesn't mean I can't build a house.
Right.
I can still build a house or a building, like in TUT's or Te Uru Taumatua's example, but I'm not going to do that at the expense of nature. I'm not going to use toxic glues. I'm not going to import a whole lot of steel from the other side of the planet. I'm going to make it as minimal impact as possible. It's still going to be beautiful. It's going to function as it needs to. It's going to serve the people, and it's going to be as aligned to Papatūānuku as possible. And so we have this beautiful whare in Tāne Atua, which you've been to, just down the road from my little house, and it's known as Te Kura Whare. And she met the Living Building Challenge that came out of Seattle. Which is a cool kind of measurement for us to start off with. She was finished in 2013, so she's been standing for now 10 years. And artwork stunning, beautiful, and
absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just a marvel of architecture.
Yeah. And there's two other buildings now. There's Te Kura Whenua, which stands at Waikaremoana, and there's Te Kura Tangata that stands at Ruatahuna, which is more of a hub for that community. And that community is sort of the kohanga of Tūhoe. It's in the middle of the forest. Beautiful, beautiful people up there. Our Tūhoe whānau from Ruatahuna. And now there's an eco-village just been built, just been finished in Tāne Atua. So those are the kinds of movements. See, another example is the road to nature. And there was a big fight with the government. It was quite hot in the media, actually, where a district council had basically got some funding, big funding, to tar seal the road that rolls through Te Uruwera. And usually they'd be like, yay, funding, millions of dollars to tar seal this road. But Tūhoe said, no way. You didn't talk to us, first of all. So they stopped the funding, which got a lot of news, media attention, some real bites back from some of the MPs. But Tūhoe's stance, or Te Uru Taumatua at the time there, was like, no, we've invested. If you tar seal, you're taking bitumen, which is, of course, a fossil fuel product. You're stealing that out of the earth from some point, and you're about to slather that across the body of Te Uruwera. That completely would make us hypocrites in terms of human management for the benefit of the land. But we recognise that this road has danger because it's a gravel road. There's dust, corrugation, potholes, and we want our families to be safe. But instead of slathering it with bitumen, we are going to invest and develop in tall oil pitch, which is a resin byproduct of the existing pine industry in Aotearoa, that you take, they've done trials, they put it across a big portion of the road, they put more gravel on top of it, so it's like a sticky resin, and it held up. And it's quite, it's at an exciting time at the moment, and so it still looks like a gravel road, which is lovely to be in the middle of the forest and not have tar sealed and paint. But it holds down the dust. It makes it much safer for our whānau, our families, and it requires more money, and it requires more maintenance. But that is the human convenience cost that we're going to give up to be in line with our values and still have our road. So everything wins, and those are the kinds of encouragement that I think that Te Uru Taumatua and Tūhoe are kind of building right now, is how do we take te kawa and this principle of human management, how do we make that alive, where we can still be us, but we can be in tune with Papatūānuku. So, yeah, it's quite cool.
Beautiful. I want to make sure we don't overly romanticize. And so I'm curious, what have been some of the challenges, or what are some of the roadblocks and stumbling blocks that you've encountered?
Yeah, cool. No, that's really important too. So I feel like, when I think about law, and usually I describe it this way, is law is all about how we relate to the land and then how we relate to each other. So law is about relationships. It's not about the Western concept of law with courts and wigs and police cars and stuff. So if you take that, how we relate to the earth and how we relate to each other, I feel like right now the wins have been in how we're relating to the earth, now that Te Uruwera owns herself. And then we have these projects that are really cool and meaty and meaningful. And then how we relate to each other and how we reset that's the challenging piece. So right now it isn't romantic back home. We have inner turmoil, and that's a really natural part that's happened right across Aotearoa, and I imagine in other parts of the world where Indigenous people are stepping into more power or are stepping out of oppression, is there's this reconciling within ourselves. And I feel like if we look at the history of oppression, what oppression means, it's an imposition from someone else to hold others down. It's a stripping of power. And when you're powerless, humans, we have to exercise some sort of power. We'll go crazy. So when you're powerless, you exercise power over those most close to you. And that those are usually your loved ones, your families. And that's a type of violence, a lateral violence that we have. And so we're reconciling with this lateral violence. And that might look like, some of our darkest days are family violence. It's a real issue with communities who've been oppressed, addiction, escapism, different types of mental health, ill health physically, mentally, spiritually, and all of the violence that suffers there. And then at a more governance level, lack of trust, all of these things are symptoms of oppression that we have to learn how to shake off and to decolonize ourselves. So I guess that's where this restoration work for me really starts to land. We have to remember how to be together, and we're not there yet. That's the work. It might take generations, and it probably will. But that's the work in front of us. It's not easy right now. There's critiques both sides. I don't need to dive into the specific kind of arguments that are happening. But I think if I could step back from it as someone that's not in a leadership position or having to be involved politically, if I can step back from it and being a younger person within my iwi, I just want to give a lot of love out to the younger generations and wanting to really seed better practices, better ways of relating to each other there, and to grow that so that when we do get to a stage where we are relied upon by our hapu and iwi to make decisions, that we get to do that as a collective, and we have what we call mate aone and tūhoe. And that's if you look at our goal, mate aone, as our mission, and that word is a really beautiful concept. So mate actually means to die, and one is like soil or earth. Mate aone might be translated as the acknowledgement that we one day will return to the earth, that one day I will die and I will become the soil. But what that sort of means is actually that I am related through all of my ancestors, related to all of you, my kinfolk within Tūhoe, right back through my ancestors, back to the land. And that I feel that connection so greatly that I yearn for you. I yearn for my family. I yearn for my land, that I might feel homesick if I'm away. That I am my land, actually, that I am my kinfolk, that I'm not just this individual body. That's the feeling of mate aone, is that yearning and aroha, like an unconditional love, basically, just by virtue of being born to these people in this place. So you'll see that as our goal, and I feel like that's the light at the end of a tunnel for us right now, is really remembering how to embody that for ourselves.
Yeah. I just want to really acknowledge, Mihi, to you, to the work that you do around that reconnection. When we first met years ago, I rocked up in my camper van and I witnessed you in the community near that living building, but, you were restoring, a very derelict structure that was for the purpose of the community of folks around you. And I think you just had like you left a power drill out and it immediately got stolen because, there's the issues of addiction and
got that back, actually.
meth. Oh, did you?
Yeah, got it back.
Nice, well done. And then you were assisting someone with their court case because there's just still so much issues happening in that, and obviously doing all of that in your spare time. People were coming in and out of the space that you occupied, and I was like kind of blown away. I'm like, wow, she has a lot of patience to just like really have a wide open door for her community of neighbors and friends at Whānau. And then you're working on this big work around what all ties together in how you're framing constitutional transformation. And I guess, before getting to that, I also just, one thing that uniquely stuck with me, having left my place of origin where I was raised, and not feeling necessarily the call to go back and do work in my local hometown, and being a bit more of a nomadic global traveler in my journey, it really was confronting for me to see how you did all of that. You went overseas, you got educated in other contexts, and then you went right back into the heart of it, where you came from. And I'm wondering if you can just speak a bit to that part of your journey as well. And yeah, it's very inspiring.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Matthew. It's cool to see what you remember. So it was a few years ago. I think that might have been pre-COVID, and it's lovely to hear your reflection back on our place, because I love my home. I grew up in Whakatane on Ohope, so just in my mother's lands. And my mum is from Tāne, which is where I live now. So she grew up there her whole life, and a lot of my family's still there. So for me, even I grew up nearby at the beach, but Tāne is where I feel the most at home in the world. Now, I went away, like you said, I went and lived in Venezuela for a year, and that was an incredible experience, probably shaped a lot of who I am today, being outside of an Anglo-Saxon kind of context and being rooted in this Latina culture where family is super important, and food and everything. And I remember that I was 16 at the time, and I remember people asking me, "Oh, you're a Māori? Oh, wow, what do you guys eat? How do you celebrate stuff? What do you do at Christmas time? All these things." And for me, at my 16-year-old self, being like, "Oh, you guys are interested in that?" Because of the racism that I had experienced. And it really switched something for me to take way more pride. And I think I always felt pride in being Māori, but when you're a teenager and people was telling you that means you're dumb and stuff, you don't prioritize it. And so when I came back, I shifted, and I felt way more ownership, I suppose, or way more belonging to my taha Māori, my Māori side. And then it sent me off to law school. I was really interested in language, and law just was, for me, about language and people. And I guess I found out later it was about power and what that meant. I learned a lot in law school about our colonisation. And I met a lot of young Māori who were talking a lot. I was part of Naranga Hautira, which is the Māori Law Students Association. And one of our kaumātua was Moana Jackson, who I just adore, and who passed on about a year ago now. And
for those who don't know Moana Jackson, maybe just a quick...
Moana Jackson, he's a legal scholar, I suppose. And he's a teacher, and he's a huge heart, and very patient. He's known as a quiet revolutionary. He had this very soft-spoken way about him, but what he would say could cut through, very sharp, very grounded in his ways and his world and his people. And he used to come and visit us at Naranga Hautira at the law school, and he would challenge us to be Māori who happens to be a lawyer. Don't be a lawyer who happens to be Māori. And he'd let us chew on that and wonder, what did he mean? And it was about really understanding that, being a lawyer can be a powerful thing, wearing this lawyer badge people automatically assume you're a certain type of person. It opens doors certainly in different ways. So making sure you don't get too carried away with this idea of the kind of ego that can come along with this power or sense of self, and making sure that we are Māori first and that we use these skills in the law to advance that. So he's a huge part of my life and my work, and for many of us. And then I finished up. I think I spent a bit of time in Mexico when I was at law school, and sharpened my other degrees in Spanish, which is really cool. So I love Te Reo Paniora, or the Spanish language, and really interested actually in the indigenous movements in America Latina now, and talking to people and learning those lessons. So when I left law school, I ended up going to Chapman Tripp, which is a big fancy law firm up in Auckland, the big city in Aotearoa, the big smoke. And I was practicing in corporate law. And I was in a team called Te Wakature, led by a guy called Nick Wells, who's a really cool dude. He's not there anymore, but he's off doing some other work. And a woman, Te Aupare Jews, who's now the partner of that Te Wakature. Te Aupare Jews is amazing person. And I was so lucky to have her as my tuakana and other women that I worked with in that team. So even though it was corporate, at a big corporate law firm, we also had this dedicated space that was really looking at Māori organisations who had settled and now had a bit of money, how they were structured and how their governance was going to work within the limits of a settler colonial law. And then the kinds of projects that could come out that could help transform. So I learnt a lot there. I learnt a lot about governance and structuring, tax, which is an important part of our reality, I guess, and relationships, So that was really interesting. It was also at a time when the corporate world's starting to use this tikanga Māori, this Māori legal system. And in this post-settlement era, that's how we refer to those iwi who have settled with the Crown. How do we start using tikanga Māori to actually drive a lot of the structures or governance or decision-making? And I realized that I could take on a career this way and try and be an expert Māori lawyer and tikanga. But if I was really honest with myself, I didn't know what that meant. I hadn't been exposed. We don't study tikanga Māori at our law school. I hadn't been exposed to that, and I realized I need to go home. And so it wasn't long after that. I think I spent almost 3 years at Chapman Tripp, and then I returned home and I began working at Te Uruto Matua, where I was really looking for leadership. I wanted people from my world, from Tūhoe, who were thinking in that way. I wanted to connect with and be led, be fostered in that way. I could feel, that corporate world, the ego, it's a game, you have to play it, and you're a product of your environment. And I could sense those things happening, and I can't do that. So going home, living in my little house, like you said, it's a tiny cottage. She's 108 years old today. I put a new roof on her since you've been there. I've got a fireplace. You've been doing a lot
of restoration work.
Yeah, she's got a lot more to go because I ended up getting super busy. But yeah, so she's my I feel like since living there, she's been like my caregiver. I've been housed within her. I feel like she has her own mauri, her own wairua, which is like her own spirit, and some really special things have happened in that space. And,
totally.
Yeah. So that's how I got back home. Yeah, that's how I got back home. And worked with Te Uruto Matua for a couple of years. And like I said, there's this unsettled space and a lot of staff turnover there for a variety of reasons. And I needed to leave. I needed to restore. So I left after 2 years. During those 2 years, I got to live at Waikaremoana, which is a stunning place. And that was my real time of deepening into the forest. I was surrounded by forests. I spent 6 months quite alone, actually, but working for TUT up there. But a lot of time with the forest. That was really good. And then, coming out of that time, that was 2019. So the last 3 years now, I've been reconnecting to the networks of movement within Aotearoa, I've been really lucky to have my home because it's meant that I could be really guided by the work rather than a salary for my life, my lifestyle. And I've been learning how to grow a garden and really connecting with people and recognizing more what it means to be in community, you know, now internationally, but definitely locally and nationally throughout Aotearoa with other people who are in the movement. And that's where my work is now, is how to look after each other, you know, in these positions, how to nurture the movement and what that might look like, and how to then, you know, our friend Georgia in River, she's cool, she says, a rising tide floats all boats. And I use that to describe, like, if what we can achieve in Aotearoa will have great impact out towards our whānau, our whanauna, and other parts of the world. So sort of from little old tāna to a pulsing out goodness and some of the projects that we're doing. So
yeah, and I'd love to hear a bit more of those projects. We went a bit deep with Jody around River.
Oh, cool.
But maybe you can touch a bit on River. But you like many people in Aotearoa, wear many hats, many different organizations, and they come and go when and where needed. Yeah. But I've heard you say, you know, the thing that binds it together is this work around constitutional transformation. So maybe you can also lead us there and make that kind of, I guess, our closing of what is constitutional transformation, and what are you envisioning there?
Awesome. Well, constitutional transformation is really taking our focus away from pruning the law to try and make it suit, taking us back to the roots of the problem, and which is the Constitution. The Constitution for any legal system is the root of the law. So whatever the Constitution says or focuses on will inform how the law evolves. And so I do transforming, you know, I use this sort of symbol. So, you know, we talked about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, with these two sovereign parties, the British Crown and Ngā Hapu Māori, or Māori people, coming together to agree how to share space peacefully over time. We pictured generations, you know. And that was the agreement, was to be like this in partnership. And then, of course, with the wars and this idea of doctrine of discovery and pretty much just a superiority complex by the British Crown, they took over our land and disconnected our people, and it ended up like this. So if this is the Māori world, our legal structure, our constitution upholds this power imbalance. So now this is how we sit, with the settler colonial law and governance above us. We still exist, of course, we're still here, but a lot of our fighting and our pruning is like trying to get a Māori health authority in here, or trying to, you know, that's still within this shape. We're dominated by this Pākehā world. So in my mind, constitutional transformation isn't just like a Māori board or co-governance or co-management. It's actually removing ourselves from under this and having a or at least bijural or plurijural legal system that recognises Te Ao Māori has kawa and tikanga, and that we have the smarts and ability and trust to be able to govern our own people in accordance with our ways. And if I had my way, this would also influence the constitution or the legal system on this side too, because at its heart, this constitution is based on this divine right of kings. The philosophy behind it is still this anthropocentric ideal that humans are separate from land, and that we, you know, most of the law, pretty much anywhere, is 90% property law, which relies on the land just being property, just this passive thing that you can buy and sell. Whereas in Indigenous legal systems, the heart of the Constitution is papatuanuku or ranginui. It's not anthropocentric, it's kin-centric, in the sense that it centers our relationship with the earth, our kinship with the earth. And so if you take that to be our constitutional foundation, then the laws that we grow from this base are going to be ones that prioritize the rights of nature, if we use that phrase, that allow for more collective decision-making in accordance with the boundaries and the limitations, natural limitations of Earth's biosphere and finite resources. We use those words. And it actually creates a belonging for everybody. So while it might sound like, Indigenous legal system sounds like it's just for Indigenous people, within our constitution, within our laws, we have ways of welcoming people in and settling people in to share the land peacefully together over time. It's inherent within our concept of manaakitanga, of whanaungatanga, of kaitiakitanga. Each of these concepts are legal concepts which, support unity, support hospitality, support care and stewardship. So I find that as a really important, abundant thinking about our legal system. And in terms of the work that we're doing, I feel like the urgent work, there's in two parts. There's a mission to conscientize our nation. And conscientization is a phrase Paulo Freire, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but you know who I'm talking about, the epic Brazilian philosopher, and he, conscientization is education for action. So there's a group of us within Teia, Tūmanako consultants who I work with, Teia with the woman Roni Tāwhai, Haimona Waititi, and different teams. We're educators, and we go out and we teach the history of Aotearoa, and we teach it in a way that we're asking people to now, okay, take responsibility. So actions, and we'll teach different organizations who might have a real ability to create impact, like philanthropists, or like we do work with philanthropy. We work with people in the tech sector, we work with people in the science area, all these people who have total ability to actually implement different ways, and we help them understand the context and from an Indigenous perspective. And they're usually really wonderful, I call them a course, but it's more of a wānanga series where you come together in a Māori space and you get to step out of that colonial reality and into a Māori space and learn in a Māori way. So that's conscientization, education for action. And then the next sort of space that I'm realizing through my work with across Aotearoa is the creation of hubs, of places that we can go to which are more restorative. And because that's the thing, for Indigenous people, we don't have space anymore. Like our space was taken away from us, like you said, 4%. We went from 100% of Aotearoa to 4%. And many of our people are, overcrowded housing. We don't have space to be settled enough to actually make good decisions and be healed and be healthy in our lives. So that's a big point. And so I think we need to find organic ways of creating spaces where it's not a teacher-learner hierarchical environment, but it's a space where on a Tuesday, you can rock down to this space. There's going to be good food there. There's going to be someone there. There's going to be cool books or cool resources where you can uplift yourself and just be connected and practice connection, practice being in a collective and being peaceful, practice having conflict, getting annoyed with someone. It's so easy to just cut them off because it's so easy to survive as an individual in our society. But if we had spaces to actually practice and then we chose a value of that space is to be connected, then we could practice collectivity. And it's that whole fractals idea that I find Adrienne Marie Brown speaks about in emergent strategy. It's not being this mastermind and being like, okay, at this hub, this thing's going to happen. It's like, by virtue of it existing, good things are going to happen. So those are the two sides of the movement. I could talk about all different things, but if I could just summarize it, it's conscientization and space to be together. Creating occasions to be together too.
How do people follow up on these threads? How do they learn more about your work and your projects and organizations, and any other recommended resources for people to go deeper?
Oh, right. It's a good question. I think, the River website's great, and contact like I'm a pretty open person, really, especially if it's for the movement. I feel a lot of my energy goes in this way. And at home, we're getting more and more organised. So there's one of the projects is called Te Kaunoti Hika Hika, or E Hika in English. That's like the stick that lights fires. And it's just a project that was supported by yourself, the Namaste Foundation, and some other groups at home. We're figuring out a pedagogy and a curriculum and a praxis for how to now teach constitutional transformation, or Mātike Mai, as a report Moana Jackson wrote, how to actually educate on that, and instead of looking always where we came from, also looking at where we could be going. So as part of that work, we're building up a bunch of resources. So if people are interested in the work and wanting to either learn about it or train and be into a facilitator kind of role and teach it, that's the kind of stuff that we're coming up with over the next year, and hopefully publishing that towards the end of this year. And so we've got a lot of things, but definitely through the River website and and contacting me directly, because the networks are too big. I'll give you a whole list of
we'll put links in the show notes. And,
great.
Make sure that people can follow the different breadcrumbs. Are there any other messages that you'd like to share? Any questions I didn't ask? That final words to leave us with?
No, I think we did such a good job of covering the big long story. Just I suppose if there's any message out there for people listening in is find your position with this movement. It is grounded in Indigenous laws and uplifting Indigenous people, but it is for all of us. And so if there's a discomfort that needs to be worked through, or there's like an opening of your heart that needs to be happening, like do that work so that we can be in this movement together. I think it can be, like we sort of discussed, it can be confronting when we're talking about, identity. But I do believe that this is from the ground up. And so if people are out there wanting to join in, like do that tricky work, be uncomfortable, move through it, and get to a point where we can be helpful for each other, so that what we create is grounded and abundant.
Well, I have so much respect for you and admiration and appreciation for how you do make it comfortable to be in uncomfortable spaces. And yes, you walk in many worlds, and you're a bridge builder, and you're a future leader and an existing leader, and a voice that I think we can all be proud of, from those of us who sit within the homelands of Aotearoa now. So thank you, Erin Matariki Carr, for being with us and sharing your voice.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Well, you can see why Matariki was such a hit at Bioneers this year. It really stuck with me what she said about the national park conservation being one of the most violent acts of colonization that could have taken place. Wow. You can learn more about Erin's work and support the project at weareriver.earth. Check out her keynote from Bioneers, as well as the conversation we had with Jody Gustafson from River Collective. Links to all of those are in the show notes, and all of the conversations we host here are available at maearth.com. That's maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.